Hello and welcome to Windows in Time, Azoreans and the Applegate, the murder of Antone Joseph, presented by Jackson County Library Services. I'm Megan and I am a librarian here at the Medford branch. Jackson County Library Services acknowledges that its libraries are located within the traditional lands of the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians and the Modoc Nation, as well as the Shasta, Takelma, and Lagawa people, whose descendants are now identified as members of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. We take this moment to recognize the indigenous peoples whose traditional lands are where residents of Jackson County live today. JCLS is committed to fostering understanding, deep respect, and honor for Indigenous people, and we encourage you to learn more about the land you reside on. For more information, go to jcls.org/land.
Well, welcome. My name is Will Brake. I am the Executive Director of the Southern Oregon Historical Society. I've been on board since about mid-February, and I've met some of you, and I look forward to meeting more of you. Today we have Heather Paladini. She moved to the Applegate Valley in 2023 from Olympia, Washington, a writer, a naturalist, bird and pollinator enthusiast, and an artist. Heather stays busy both on her property and in the local community. She owns and operates Wild Oak Preschool on her homestead property, volunteers with A Greater Applegate, and runs a children's program for the Williams and Applegate Farmers Market. So welcome, Heather.
Thank you.
Enjoy her talk. Thank you.
The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Jackson County Library Services.
Thanks for being here. My name is Heather, and I'm here to share about the lives of those connected to the homestead farm property where I now live on Williams Highway, and that includes the murder of Antone Joseph. So the story begins in 2023 when I purchased the home of local historical significance in the Applegate Valley. The home was built in 1900, and so I knew that there would be a lot to discover about the lives that have come through that property, and I really couldn't wait to get started on my research. Living in a 100-year-old farmhouse was a longtime dream of mine, and so it felt like it was meant to be when it actually came true. I imagined that I'd begin my excavation into the past by visiting the courthouse and digging through old records, working my way backwards in time to create a sort of timeline. And I imagined it would take quite some time, but to my surprise, I got a bit of a head start my first couple of days in the house. When deep cleaning in the home, I found some relics of the past, an uncanny discovery that launched me into the early 1900s. Right away. I found letters from the past on top of an old kitchen cupboard, including a 1918 brochure to Crater Lake National Park and an old postcard and a letter. There was a postcard from Portland from someone written to Myrtle, someone named Myrtle Ledikin. Let's look at that for a second. And my favorite was this letter. This letter was written in 1922 to Myrtle Ledikin from a woman named Mrs. Hill, whose census records confirmed lived right up the road with her husband, Callie. The letters gave me a starting point for my research into the history of my new old home. And I'm going to read this letter because I think it is really sweet and kind of gives a little glimpse into the lives of two women from 100 years ago. Dear Myrtle, don't you think you have flu long enough? I do. 2 times a day I have called up Central or somebody to find out how you are getting along. Say, pal of mine, that is awful hard on the nervous system, so please come out of it. We had a spell of something, but don't know whether it was what everybody else is having or not. We didn't have to call the doctor. Mrs. Kavanaugh has been having the asthma the last 3 days and has been here so I could help her jaw the kids as she runs out of breath too quick. Don't you get in too big a hurry to do things, but take care of yourself so you won't be all fagged out all summer. The violets are budded if there is snow on the ground, so just cheer up. Spring is coming. Well, I must get busy with the ironing. Cal said he was going to the store, so I thought I would just drop you a line to let you know you wasn't forgotten. I don't like to phone to you for when you all feel bad. It is a nuisance to answer phone calls. With love, Mrs. Hill. I just love that. And that line that I bolded there, I'm actually going to make a little sign and put it in my garden because it brings me so much joy. So who was Myrtle Ledekin? Myrtle Ledekin was born in January of 1892 to John H. Ledekin and Antone Joseph, who were both listed as early pioneers and settlers of this area in Oregon. John Ledekin traveled west from Kansas. He was a child with his pioneering family. They ended up taking the railroad up to southern Oregon and arrived in around 1875. This is one of the pioneer records here. Antone Joseph was born to Samuel Provault and Harriet Newell, who were Oregon Trail pioneers. She was one of 7 children. She was born in Montana. They made a one-year stopover on their way west on the Oregon Trail. Myrtle Ledekin never married, and in 1920, she was listed in the census as still living with her parents with the occupation of housekeeper. Tragically, she was struck by a car while crossing the street with her mother in Grants Pass in 1924. The car was driven by a young girl, and her mother was gravely injured and Myrtle died. The article has the wrong age for Myrtle in there. I have her death certificate here. Myrtle Ledekin is buried at the Sparland Cemetery, which is less than a mile as the crow flies from my house. And interestingly, when I first went there to look for her grave, I just happened to park right in front of her grave, having no idea where it would be. So I thought that was really neat. There's not been a whole lot of information about the life of Myrtle, but I've come across a few charming little articles about things like them making an outing to the circus and visiting their grandfather, Samuel Provault, up the road. Things like that made the local news back then. And this article is, there's a couple things in here that kind of give a little glimpse into how sweet life was in Provault back then and might still be. Well, here it says, where can there be any better place than Provault to live, where you have ripe strawberries the 26th day of November and up to Christmas, which brings back the memory of the beautiful spring of the year. The article talks about how the fertile soil and the many different varieties of produce can be raised and how it's situated at the mouth of Williams Valley. And it's just really talking about trying to sell what a beautiful area this was to settle. And it goes on to mention Thomas Lumen in the article, which interestingly I mentioned because his descendant, Richard Lumen, is actually my neighbor. And so that property, which is like two houses down from where I currently live, has been in the Lumen family since the 1800s. And Richard Lumen still farms his property today. I've never found any photos of Myrtle Ledekin to date, but there is a beautiful old Oregon myrtle tree, also known as a California bay laurel, which stands right next to the farmhouse that I believe may have been planted for her upon her death 100 years ago. I read that these trees can be over 200 years old, and this one is very large, and I've had people come and take a look at it and estimate that it could be about 100 years old. My search for information about Myrtle is ongoing, and while I haven't been able to find out a whole lot about her, it fascinates me, especially because of those letters. I have, however, found out quite a lot about her family, especially given that her grandfather was Samuel Provault. Samuel Provault was an early settler of the Applegate Valley, and he arrived with his wife Harriet and 7 children around 1866. He became really successful with gold mining and began to pursue agricultural ventures and eventually acquired over 360 acres of land in the Applegate Valley. He also owned a lot of real estate in Grants Pass that he leased out. And these were grandparents of Myrtle Ledekin. And they owned the property from 1905 until 1919. Samuel Provault also opened the Provault store, which is now known as the Provault Country Store. He opened it in 1875. It was across the road from its current location, where he moved it in 1904. It's still in business today. It's about 3 miles north of the farmhouse. And it's thought to be one of the oldest continuously operated establishments in Southern Oregon. In the photo, it may be hard to see, but this is actually Samuel Ledekin, Myrtle's brother, in the buggy in front of the store. So Samuel Provault was possibly the 3rd owner of the farmhouse and the 5th owner of the land. He lived just up the road on the Jackson County side on another 160-acre parcel, and he bought this farmhouse and land on Williams Highway in Josephine County from Thomas Kinney in 1905. He then leased it to his son-in-law, John Ledekin, and his daughter, Athangia, and they lived there with their children, and they would farm the 160-acre parcel. It would remain in the family until Athangia's death in 1944. This article talks about how Samuel Probalt was one of the wealthy farmers of the Applegate Valley and how he was a grass expert and had been testing new grasses for the last 20 years, and just really interesting. Samuel Probalt died in 1919, and Athangia then held the deed for the property until her death in 1944. In Samuel Probalt's will, the farm property was referred to as the Antone place, referring to Antone Rose, Antone Joseph, presumably. Thomas Kinney, whom Samuel Probalt purchased the property from in 1905, was possibly the second owner of the farmhouse and fourth owner of the property. Kinney was a notable historical figure of Jacksonville, and he owned the entire business block downtown. Records show that he bought the 160-acre farmhouse property from Sheriff Ed Lister in 1900, who held the deed very briefly, perhaps due to a contested will. It's not clear whether the house was yet built when he acquired the deed, since the house was also built in 1900. We know that Thomas Kinney never lived in the farmhouse, since we know that he lived in Jacksonville during that time, but he did successfully farm the land on Williams Creek, and perhaps he had the house built for whomever managed the farm. He grew wheat, oats, barley, corn, potatoes. He only owned it for 5 years before he sold it to Samuel Probalt. This article is about how he went to Williams Creek to check on the crops growing at his farm. And while he was there, he came upon a little fawn that had become separated from its mother. He had no difficulty in capturing it, and he placed it in his buggy, and he brought it home and gave it to his children in Jacksonville as a pet. And they have it so gentle that it answers to its name and plays with them like a lamb. And when I first read that, I just thought that was so sweet. And it made me wonder if that was the beginning of the docile deer in Jacksonville, because those deer are not afraid of people. But this begs the question, why did Sheriff Ed Lister own the property in 1900? Well, it turns out that the owner prior to the sheriff was Antone Rose, the ditch tender for the Sterling mine. Antone Rose would likely have been the first owner of the farmhouse and was indeed the second owner of the property. Antone Rose was born in Portugal around 1849 and immigrated to the U.S. in 1861. By 1900, he was the defendant in multiple lawsuits for ejectment, return of property, payment of money. But why and how did he end up with the property? Well, I found out that Antone Rose inherited the farm from his uncle, Antone Joseph. So Antone Rose and his wife, Mayetta, lived on the farm property after inheriting it from his late uncle in 1893. Census records placed them there in 1900, and later census records have them in Jacksonville. So we know they were at least there until 1900. The terms under which he inherited it were under scrutiny, as it appeared that there was some sort of verbal agreement Rose had with his uncle that may or may not have held up in order that he may or may not have held up in order to receive the inheritance, because there was no written will. There were ongoing lawsuits for years about the will and the property with various relatives of Antone Joseph, Antone Rose's uncle. The terms under which Antone Rose inherited his uncle's estate were being contested. This article goes into detail about it. It said that in the 1870s, Antone Joseph wrote back home to his brother in Boston, not home, for one of his nephews to come and live with him. And Antone Rose was meant to caretake for his uncle, who was said to be infirm, eccentric, and peculiar, speaking very little English. Antone Rose answered the call, but it was said that he was absent for much of the time and therefore undeserving of the estate that he inherited. And that's why he was being sued and the will was being contested. These lawsuits carried on for years. Antone Joseph, like his nephew, Antone Rose, was an immigrant from Portugal, along with many others who left the Portuguese Azoreans in the mid-1800s. Antone Joseph received his naturalization papers in Oregon in 1862, and sometime thereafter came to have mining claims on Williams Creek in the Applegate Valley. It said that he was eccentric and uneducated, but this assumption could very well have been due to the fact that he just spoke little to no English. But these are his naturalization papers here. And in 1876, Antone Joseph was granted homestead certificate number 648 for the 160-acre parcel of land along Williams Creek, where he had mining claims. Being an immigrant who did not speak the language of other settlers in the valley, he kept to himself and was therefore considered eccentric. Eccentric or not, he was successful with gold mining and became quite wealthy, as tax records would suggest. He did not use a bank, however, and it was later discovered that he would hide his wealth in the walls of his home. And this here shows that he had a tax bill of $2,000, which is quite a lot at that time. In 1893, Antone Joseph was found murdered on his farm. In this article, there are a lot of different articles about the murder, but I'll read this one. Antone Joseph, a Portuguese who has resided on a farm in Williams Creek in Josephine County, 20 miles west of Jacksonville, was missing from his home the first of this week. As he was rarely known to leave his farm, the neighbors became apprehensive and a search was made, resulting in finding his dead body a short distance from his home with a bullet hole through his head. From indications, he was shot in a small trail near his house and the body dragged into the brush where it was found. The other article goes into a little more detail where it says, it is believed that he had accumulated considerable money as he was frugal and industrious. He was about 70 years of age and was never married and lived alone on his farm. A nephew is the only relative living here. Robbery is supposed to have been the motive for the murder. The coroner at Josephine County is holding an inquest today, and the interment will begin in Jacksonville Cemetery tomorrow. So who killed Antone Joseph? Shortly after the discovery of the murder of Antone Joseph, the sheriff and constables began the search and capture of the 22-year-old Charles Slagle with his brother-in-law, G.W. Meek, under suspicion for involvement. Slagle was already being charged with arson actually, it was in Klamath Falls just weeks before, and it was believed that he committed the murder of Antone Joseph as well. It was known that Antone Joseph was wealthy, yet his riches had not yet been found. So Charles Slagle was determined guilty of the murder of Antone Joseph and was ultimately charged with murder in the second degree and sentenced to life in prison. But why did he murder Antone Joseph, and where was his money? This article goes into some detail about the story, accounts of people who testified about the murder. While serving his sentence in prison, a reporter came to visit Slagle for an interview. During this interview, Slagle confessed that he was hired to kill Antone Joseph for his money, but that he never got any of the gold, and it was not revealed who hired the hit. It was believed that perhaps the sheriff had more information about it, but concealed it while trying to pursue those people. But I never found any articles saying who they were. I don't know if anybody else has. So Antone Rose came forward and revealed that he knew where his uncle Antone Joseph had hidden all of his gold. This crucial piece of evidence seemed enough to vindicate Antone Rose of any involvement in his uncle's murder. Antone Joseph's gold was stashed in bags of $100 each within a hidden compartment in the walls of his home, over $1,700 worth. It appeared that Joseph also had a decoy stash of $250 hidden elsewhere in the home to deter thieves. An inflation calculator values the sum of Antone Joseph's riches to be over $50,000 in today's money. This one article says, if the location of the coin had not been previously known by his nephew, it would perhaps have remained hidden for many years yet. Charles Slagle was pardoned in 1908, 15 years after being sentenced to life in prison for the 1893 murder of Antone Joseph. Governor Benson granted a conditional pardon of several prisoners serving life sentences, and Slagle was one of them. 8 months later, he eloped with his 15-year-old niece, who was G.W. Meek's daughter, who was discovered to be in a delicate condition. Slagle's parole was revoked, and he was sent back to prison. Additional records indicate that Slagle was once again released in the following decade and later died by suicide. There are many mysteries that still remain. While there are still many unknowns to this mystery, it is known that Antone Rose and his wife ultimately moved to Jacksonville, where they died in 1922 and 1920, respectively. Both are buried in the Jacksonville Cemetery. My research has not yet illuminated who may have hired the murder of Antone Joseph. I have still not learned who built the home I now live in 1900. I don't know if it was Antone Rose, who last owned the property in 1900, or if it was Thomas Kinney, who purchased it in 1900. What other mysteries do these walls contain? No.
Do we have any questions in person? Two hands. I saw Laura was first. Or do you want me to go? I'm going over here. Thank you. Be interested to know which newspapers these articles were from.
Oh, okay. I did most of my newspaper research using the newspapers.com archive. And so I think a lot of those were from the Rogue Courier, I believe, and the Grants Pass Courier. I should have put that in there though. Thank you. Yeah.
Megan, do we have any online questions or comments?
We do not at this time.
Okay, I think we have one question over here and then one back there. I'll get to you in a second. Also, Heather, you mentioned that Antone Rose was the ditch tender at Sterling Creek.
Yes.
And that's a very strong Jackson County tie to your story, the story of the Applegate Valley. So it ties both Josephine and Jackson County together. One thing I found when I started to talk with you about your research into your home, very interesting, was that Antone Rose's wife, Mayette, was Mayette Gilson. And Gilson Gulch is one of the tributaries to Sterling Creek, and her father, Thomas Gilson, was one of the most significant early miners there too. That's just one of many things that tie this story into a lot of other chapters of our Applegate history.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I know there are so many different parts that are like interconnected that I probably so much more that I haven't even made the connections on yet, but I appreciate your insight.
And I want to make one last plug for Mayette. She went by May. She was a school teacher, and in 1893, the Democratic Party had her run for superintendent of the county schools.
That's
she couldn't vote, but they thought that she was qualified to run the entire school district.
That's right.
No.
So the question was if she won, and she didn't, unfortunately. Any other questions online or comments, Megan?
There are none right now.
Okay, we have a question back here.
Was this Rose family in relation to the Roses of Phoenix? They were a very prominent family in Phoenix.
I don't think so. And if it's okay with you, would defer that question to you because I know that you have a little bit more research. Laura.
I don't believe so. We looked more closely at whether this was related to Orlando Rose, who had a big home and dance hall in the Applegate Village area. And we know that's not a relation there. And most of Antone Rose's family was in the Rhode Island area. A lot of the Azoreans went into Rhode Island in the early half of the 19th century because they were good at sailing. So when whaling was still in the ascendance, that's when we had a big influx of Portuguese. And in like Rhode Island, you'll still find many Portuguese-oriented neighborhoods. So other than Antone Rose coming out, he had another uncle who ended up in the Red Bluff area. They were the ones behind all the lawsuits. And they changed their name to Enos. So we don't think that this is a Rose family related to any other Jackson County Rose.
Thank you, Laura.
Any online questions or comments, Megan?
There are none in the chat.
Okay, we have one more question here.
This is not a question, but just a comment. My maiden name was Silva, and I grew up on a ranch outside of Wairika. And my great grandparents came from the Azores in the 1850s and settled the ranch. Some of it homesteaded.
Wow.
And if you're interested in any of the Portuguese celebrations, there will be a festa in Hawkinsville, which is just north of Wairika, June 1st. And this has gone on for more than 100 years.
Wow. Thank you.
Any other in-person questions? Oh, back here. Thank you. You guys just talk in the mic.
I was wondering why it was only second-degree murder, the charge, rather than just regular first-degree murder.
That's a really good question. I'm not actually sure why it was second degree and not first degree. Laura, do you happen to have any insight into that?
This is pure speculation, but we see this in other murder cases. And in the Schlegel family, although this was their black sheep son, they were quite significant there, right? Schlegel Creek is named for their homestead. The homestead was deemed a historic property by Jackson County in its 1970 surveys. So I'm gonna think it was probably in part a political accommodation to the remaining descendants of Conrad Schlegel, but also Charles was not a good guy. He was a bad guy, but he got duped, right? Somebody connived him into committing the murder, and then he walked away with none of the gold. So it may have also reflected that he wasn't the sole bad guy, and it was easier to sell the jury on a second degree charge that wouldn't potentially attract a death sentence as opposed to life imprisonment. But that's just my speculation.
That makes sense.
Any other questions or comments? Megan, anything from the online audience?
There's nothing in the chat.
All right, I think we're going to finish a little early. Thank you for coming. Next Wednesday, we'll be talking about shreds and patches, OSF Uncovered with Jonathan Stevens. Feel free to join us in person or online. Thank you very much.